The alarm system screamed throughout the alien ship as Commander Reshikal gripped his station with trembling hands. His crystalline skin, normally a calm blue color, now flickered with panicked orange patterns. Around him, his crew of scientists worked desperately at their consoles trying to save their dying vessel. The research ship had been studying the strange nebula for 3 weeks when everything went wrong. A sudden energy surge had torn through their main engine, and now they were drifting in the darkness of space with no way to move. Worse still, their life support systems were failing. The air was getting thinner with each passing hour. Reshikal looked at the faces of his crew. These were not soldiers or warriors. They were researchers, teachers, and explorers from the peaceful Valen species. They had families waiting for them back home. Children who would never see their parents again if help did not arrive soon. "Send the distress signal again," Reshikal ordered, though he knew it was probably useless. They were far from any Valen space, and no Allied ships were close enough to reach them in time. But he had to try. He could not let his people die without fighting for their survival. 3 days away, Captain Paul Griffin sat in the command chair of the human exploration vessel, drinking his morning coffee. The bridge was quiet, with only the soft beeping of instruments breaking the silence. His crew was small but skilled. They had been mapping new star systems for the past 6 months, and everyone was tired and ready to go home. Lisa Morgan, the chief engineer, walked onto the bridge with a data pad in her hand. She was a tough woman with short red hair and oil stains on her uniform. "Captain, we're running low on supplies. If we want to make it back to the nearest station without rationing food, we need to start heading back now." Paul nodded. He was about to give the order when Danny Walsh, their communications officer, suddenly sat up straight at his station. "Captain, I'm picking up something strange. It's a distress signal, but it's not in any language our computers recognize." Paul set down his coffee cup. "Can you locate the source?" Danny's fingers moved quickly across his console. "Yes, sir. It's coming from coordinates about 3 days from our current position. The signal is weak and breaking up, but it's definitely a call for help." Lisa frowned. "Captain, if we go check that out, we'll be almost a week behind schedule. Our supplies won't last that long comfortably." Paul stood up and walked over to Danny's station, looking at the data on the screen. The signal was desperate, repeating the same pattern over and over. Someone out there was dying, and they were calling into the void hoping anyone would hear them. "How many people do you think are on that ship?" Paul asked. Danny shook his head. "No way to tell from here, sir. Could be 10, could be 100. Paul thought about his own crew. 12 people who trusted him to make the right decisions. If they went to help these strangers, they would all have to eat less. They would be uncomfortable, but they would live. The people sending that distress call might not have days left. They might only have hours. Set a course for those coordinates," Paul ordered. "Maximum speed." Lisa started to protest, but Paul held up his hand. "I know what you're going to say, Lisa, but we can survive on shorter rations. Those people out there might not survive at all if we don't help them." "We're going." The engineer sighed but nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll make sure the engines are running at peak efficiency." For 3 days, the human ship pushed through space as fast as it could go. The crew ate smaller meals without complaining. They all knew what they were doing was right, even if it meant going hungry. Paul barely slept, worried they might arrive too late. When they finally reached the coordinates, they found the Velan ship drifting like a dead thing in space. Its hull was dark and no lights showed in its windows. For a terrible moment, Paul thought they had arrived too late. "Captain, I'm detecting life signs," Danny reported, relief clear in his voice. "Faint, but they're there. I count 47 individuals still alive." Paul let out a breath he did not know he was holding. "Open a channel. All frequencies." The communication system crackled to life and Paul spoke clearly. "Unknown vessel, this is Captain Paul Griffin of the human ship Horizon's Edge. We received your distress call. We are here to help you. Please respond." For a long moment there was only silence. Then a voice came through, speaking in a language the computer could not translate. But the tone was clear. It was filled with desperate hope. "Danny, work with their computer systems to establish a translation protocol. Lisa, I want you to get a team ready. We're going over there to see what we can do." Over the next several hours, the two ships worked together despite the language barrier. Lisa and her engineering team went aboard the Velan vessel in protective suits, carrying spare parts and tools. What they found inside was shocking. The aliens were tall, almost 7 feet each, with skin that looked like crystal and glowed with soft colors. They were beautiful and strange, and they looked at the humans with wonder in their large eyes. They had never seen creatures like humans before. Lisa got to work immediately, not caring about the strangeness of the situation. She saw the damaged engine and understood what needed to be done. Her team worked for 18 hours straight, barely stopping to rest. They transferred power cells, repaired broken systems, and restored the life support to full function. Danny Walsh, working from the human ship, managed to create a basic translation program. It was not perfect, but it allowed both sides to communicate simple ideas. Commander Reshkal was able to express his deep gratitude. "You came." The translation program rendered his words in a mechanical voice. "We thought we would die here. You saved us all." Paul shook his head. "We did what anyone should do. You needed help, and we could provide it." Reshikal's skin flickered with colors that the humans did not understand but somehow felt were important. The Velen commander reached into a compartment and pulled out a small crystal that glowed with inner light. Through the translator, Reshkal explained, "This is a memory crystal. It records this debt we owe you. In our culture, such debts are sacred. We will remember what you have done." Paul accepted the crystal politely, though he did not fully understand its meaning. To him, they had simply done the right thing. No payment or recognition was needed, but he could see it was important to the alien commander, so he took it with respect. After making sure the Velen ship was safe to travel, the two vessels parted ways. The Velan headed home to their families, and the humans continued their journey, now on even shorter rations but satisfied with their choice. As Paul sat in his quarters that night, looking at the glowing crystal, he had no idea that this simple act of kindness would one day change the entire galaxy. He was just glad he had helped someone in need. The crystal sat on his desk, pulsing softly with light, holding within it a debt that humanity would one day repay in ways no one could imagine. 23 years had passed since the rescue, and the galaxy had changed in many ways. Humanity had grown bolder, sending more ships into deep space and meeting new species almost every year. Trade routes connected dozens of worlds, and human colonies spread across multiple star systems. They were no longer the newcomers struggling to find their place among the stars. Paul Griffin was now 68 years old and long retired from space exploration. He lived on a peaceful colony world called New Terra, with his wife and 2 grandchildren. His days of adventure were behind him, replaced by quiet mornings watching the sunrise and afternoons teaching his grandson how to fish in the local streams. The memory crystal from the Velen sat in a display case in his living room, a curiosity that visitors sometimes asked about. Lisa Morgan had risen through the ranks and now commanded her own exploration vessel. She rarely thought about that rescue mission so long ago, as it had been just one of many encounters in her long career. Danny Walsh taught at the Communications Academy on Earth, training the next generation of officers in first contact protocols and alien linguistics. The Velen Confederation had also grown. Their scientific advances had made them valuable allies to many species. They had developed new medical technologies, better faster-than-light engines, and terraforming techniques that had helped dozens of worlds become habitable. The Velen were respected throughout the galaxy as peaceful innovators who preferred research over conflict. Commander Reshkal was now an elder on the Velen Council, his crystalline skin having faded to a pale silver with age. He had never forgotten the humans who saved his ship, and he kept his own copy of the memory crystal in his office. Sometimes he would hold it and remember the strange, small aliens who had risked their own comfort to save his crew. He wondered if humans remembered that day, or if it had been just another routine mission for them. But peace never lasts forever. In a distant part of the galaxy, a militaristic empire called the Drax Ascendancy had been growing in power and ambition. The Drax were a warrior species who believed that strength was the only thing that mattered. They conquered world after world, enslaving populations and taking resources. Their fleet was massive, filled with battleships designed only for destruction. For years, the Drax had been content with taking fringe worlds that no one cared about. But now they wanted more. Their emperor had set his sight on the rich systems controlled by the Velen Confederation. The Velen worlds were full of rare minerals, advanced technology, and billions of peaceful beings who would make excellent slave labor. The Drax fleet appeared without warning at the edge of Velen space. 300 warships, each one bristling with weapons and carrying thousands of soldiers. They sent no message, made no demands. They simply began their attack. The Valen military was small and outdated. They had focused their resources on science and exploration, not weapons and war. Their few defense ships fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed within hours. The Drax fleet pushed deeper into Valen territory, destroying orbital stations and bombarding colony worlds. Within 5 days, the Drax armada reached Vela Prime, the Valen homeworld. 8 billion Velen lived on that beautiful planet of crystal cities and floating gardens. Now Drax warships surrounded their world, blocking any escape. Dropships began landing on the surface, carrying invasion forces that swept through cities with brutal efficiency. Reshkal stood in the emergency council chamber deep underground, watching the reports come in on holographic displays. The news was all bad. The orbital defenses had been shattered. The military was scattered and broken. Millions of Velen were already dead or captured. In another week, maybe less, their entire civilization would be enslaved or exterminated. "We must surrender," one council member said, his skin flickering with the gray color of despair. "If we give them what they want, perhaps they will spare our people." "The Drax do not show mercy," another replied. "They will take everything regardless. Surrender only makes it easier for them." Reshkal listened to the debate but said nothing. His mind had gone back to that day 23 years ago, when his own ship had been dying in space. He had sent out a distress call expecting nothing, and humans had come. They had risked their own safety for strangers they had never met. He stood up slowly, his old joints aching. Everyone in the chamber turned to look at him. "There is one chance," he said quietly. "One species that might help us." The other council members looked confused. The Valen had many trade partners, but none had military forces strong enough to challenge the Drax. No one would risk war with such a powerful empire to save them. Reshkal walked to a secure vault at the back of the chamber and removed a small case. Inside was the original memory crystal, still glowing with soft light after all these years. 23 years ago, humans saved my ship and my crew when we were dying in deep space. According to our oldest traditions, they carry a debt of honor from that day. Humans, another council member said doubtfully. "I have heard of them. They are a young species, barely 2 centuries in space. They have some ships and colonies, but they are not a major military power. What could they do against the Drax?" Reshkal held the crystal carefully in his hands. "I do not know. But they came when I called before, even though they had no reason to help us. Perhaps they will come again. Even if they wanted to help, they are weeks away. By the time any message reaches them and they organize a response, we will already be conquered. Then we have nothing to lose by trying," Reshkal said firmly. He had made his decision. He connected the memory crystal to the long-range communications array and began composing a message. It was simple and direct, translated into human language by their computers. To humanity from the Valen Confederation. 23 years ago, Captain Paul Griffin and his crew saved 47 Velen lives when our ship was dying. We gave you a memory crystal recording this debt. Now we call upon that debt. Our world is under attack. Billions of our people face death or slavery. We have no right to ask this of you, but we are asking anyway. Please, if you remember us, help us. We are dying." The message was sent out across the vast distances of space, aimed at the nearest human colonies and relay stations. Reshkal did not know if anyone would receive it, or if they would care if they did. Humans might have forgotten about one small rescue mission decades ago. They might decide that helping the Velen was not worth the cost, but he had to try. As he watched the signal vanish into the darkness between stars, Reshkal felt a small flicker of hope. He remembered the determination in Captain Griffin's eyes, the way the human crew had worked so hard to save strangers. If humanity was still the same species that had helped him all those years ago, maybe they would remember. Above the planet, another Drax bombardment began. Crystal towers shattered and fell. People screamed and ran through burning streets. The council chamber shook from the impact of explosions on the surface. Reshkal sat down and waited. All they could do now was hold on as long as possible and hope that somewhere in the galaxy humanity was listening, hope that they remembered, hope that they cared enough to come. The memory crystal pulsed softly in the darkness, carrying within it a promise made 23 years ago by a species that Reshkal barely understood. He had saved that crystal for over 2 decades, never imagining he would actually need to use it. Now as his world burned above him, that small glowing crystal represented the last hope of his entire civilization. The message from the Valen reached Earth 3 days after it was sent, arriving at a communications relay station in the outer colonies. The technician on duty almost deleted it as spam before he noticed the unusual encryption and the reference to a memory crystal. Curious, he forwarded it to Fleet Command on Earth. At Fleet Command, the message sat in a queue for 6 hours before an analyst named Gary Peters opened it during his night shift. He read it twice, confused by the reference to Captain Paul Griffin and a rescue mission from 23 years ago. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he could not place it. Gary searched the archives and found the old mission report from the exploration vessel Horizon's Edge. It was a simple document, barely 3 pages long, describing the rescue of an alien ship in distress. Nothing remarkable. It had been filed and forgotten. Just another routine incident in the vast database of human space operations. But the message from the Valen was not routine. Gary read the desperate plea for help again, and something stirred in his chest. These aliens were calling in a debt from decades ago, asking humanity to help them fight against an enemy that was destroying their civilization. He forwarded the message to his supervisor with a priority flag. Within an hour, it had reached the desk of Admiral Kate Brennan, one of the highest-ranking officers in the human fleet. She read it in her office while drinking her morning tea, and then she read it again. Kate Brennan was a practical woman who had spent 40 years in the military. She understood politics, resources, and the harsh realities of interstellar relations. The smart move would be to ignore this message. The Drax ascendancy was powerful and far away. Getting involved in their war would cost human lives and resources with no clear benefit to humanity. But as she read the message a third time, she thought about the kind of species that would remember a debt from 23 years ago. A species that would call for help based on one act of kindness by a single ship crew. She thought about what it said about humanity if they ignored such a call. Kate picked up her communicator and made several calls. Within 2 hours, she had authorization to organize a response fleet. But she wanted to do something first. She wanted to talk to the people who had been there that day. Paul Griffin was feeding his chickens when his communicator buzzed with an incoming call marked as high-priority military. He almost did not answer it, assuming it was some kind of mistake. But curiosity got the better of him. Admiral Brennan's face appeared on the screen. "Captain Griffin, I apologize for disturbing your retirement, but I need to ask you about something that happened 23 years ago." Paul listened as the Admiral explained about the message from the Valen. As she spoke, Paul walked into his house and looked at the memory crystal still sitting in its display case. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. "Admiral," Paul said slowly, "I remember that day very clearly. The Valen were good people who were going to die if someone did not help them. So we helped them. It was the right thing to do." "They're dying again," Kate said, "and they're asking for our help. I'm putting together a fleet, but I wanted you to know first. This is because of what you did." Paul felt a mix of emotions, pride that his actions had mattered, worry about the young people who would be risking their lives. But mostly he felt something simpler. The Valen had needed help before, and humans had given it. Now they needed help again. The decision was obvious. "You have to go," Paul said firmly. "We made a promise that day, even if we did not realize it. Humanity keeps its promises." The Admiral nodded. "That's what I think too. I just wanted to hear you say it." Over the next 72 hours, something remarkable happened throughout human space. The story of the rescue mission spread across the networks. News programs interviewed Paul Griffin and showed footage of the Valen calling for help. Social media exploded with debates and discussions, but mostly people just got ready to help. Lisa Morgan, now commanding her own ship, volunteered immediately when she heard the news. "That was my mission too," she told her crew. "I was there. We're going." Danny Walsh, though too old for active service, worked with the translation teams to make sure the humans and Valen could communicate effectively during combat operations. "I helped build the first bridge between our species," he said. "I'll help defend it now." The most surprising response came from the civilian sector. Cargo ship captains, mining vessel operators, transport pilots, and even some retired military personnel began messaging Fleet Command with the same request. "Let us help." At first, Admiral Brennan tried to refuse. These were not warships or trained military crews. But the messages kept coming. Thousands of them. People from every human colony and station wanted to be part of the response. A freighter captain named Joe Martinez sent a message that Kate Brennan would remember for the rest of her life. My daughter studies medicine using techniques the Velen developed. They've helped humanity in 100 ways since we met them. Now they need us. I've got a ship and a crew, and we're going whether the military wants us or not. You might as well coordinate with us. Kate realized she could not stop the civilian fleet even if she wanted to, and maybe she did not want to. This was what humanity was, she thought. Not just the military, but ordinary people who believed that debts should be paid and friends should be defended. She made the official announcement. Any human vessel, military or civilian, was welcome to join the relief fleet heading to Vela Prime. They would be coordinated under military command, but everyone who wanted to help would be given a chance. The response was overwhelming. 300 military vessels, including destroyers, cruisers, and support ships, formed the core of the fleet. But around them gathered over 15,000 civilian vessels of every type imaginable. There were mining ships with industrial cutting tools that could be weaponized, cargo haulers with massive cargo bays that could carry troops or supplies, colony transports designed to evacuate entire populations, medical ships ready to treat wounded. Even some ancient warships that had been retired decades ago were brought out of storage and made ready to fly again. The crews were just as diverse. There were career military personnel who had trained for combat their whole lives. But there were also engineers like Nick Perry who had worked with Velen technology and wanted to defend the people who had taught him. There were doctors like Amy Chen who had studied under Velen medical experts and felt obligated to help. And there were thousands of ordinary people who simply believed it was the right thing to do. Admiral Brennan stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the fleet assembling around her. It was the largest human fleet ever gathered, and most of it was made up of volunteers who had no military training and no obligation to be there. She recorded a message to send ahead to the Velen. Commander Reshikal, this is Admiral Kate Brennan of the human fleet. We received your call. We remember the debt. We are coming with everything we have. Hold on. We will be there in 3 weeks. The massive fleet began its journey across the galaxy. In every ship, human and alien crew members prepared for what was coming. They checked weapons, reviewed tactics, said goodbye to loved ones through long-range communications. On New Terra, Paul Griffin stood in his yard and looked up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, thousands of humans were traveling to help people they had never met. Because of something he had done 23 years ago, it made him feel old and young at the same time. His wife came out and stood beside him. "Do you think they'll make it in time?" she asked. Paul thought about the determination he had heard in Admiral Brennan's voice. He thought about Lisa Morgan and all the others who had volunteered without hesitation. He thought about the 15,000 civilian ships being flown by ordinary people who just wanted to do the right thing. "Yes," he said simply, "they'll make it, because that's what we do." The Drax warlord Thax stood on the command deck of his massive flagship, looking down at the burning world below. Vela Prime was almost completely conquered now. The remaining Velen defenders were scattered and weak, hiding in underground shelters while his forces hunted them through the ruins of their cities. Thax was proud of this victory. In just 2 weeks, his fleet had crushed an entire civilization. Soon, the Velen would be put to work in the labor camps and their advanced technology would belong to the Drax Empire. It was exactly how conquest should be: quick, brutal, and profitable. His second-in-command approached with a concerned expression. "Warlord, our long-range sensors have detected something unusual. A large fleet is approaching our position." Thax barely glanced at the report. "How large?" "Approximately 15,000 vessels, sir. But most of them appear to be civilian craft. No significant military threat." The warlord laughed. "Some neighboring species trying to evacuate Velen refugees, probably. Let them come. We will destroy them and enslave their people, too. Easy prey. Sir, there is something else. The fleet is human." Thax frowned. He had heard of humans. They were a young species that had expanded rapidly, but were not considered a major military power. Why would they come here? The Velen were nothing to them. "Are the humans allied with the Velen?" Thax asked. "Not officially, sir. They have some trade agreements but no mutual defense treaties." "Then they are fools," Thax decided. "Prepare the fleet. When the humans arrive, we will show them what happens to those who interfere with the Drax ascendancy." Far above the planet, in a hidden underground shelter, Commander Reshkal received the message from Admiral Brennan. The translation was rough, but the meaning was clear. Humanity was coming. They had not forgotten. They were bringing a fleet to help. Reshkal felt tears forming in his large eyes, something Valen rarely did. Around him, other council members gathered to hear the news. Many of them had doubted that the humans would respond. Some had thought the message would never even reach them. But they had come. Not just a few ships, but an entire armada. They are 3 days away, Reshkal told his people. We must hold on for 3 more days. Tell every defender, every survivor, help is coming. The message spread through the underground networks where the remaining Valen hid. People who had lost all hope suddenly found the strength to keep fighting. They had to survive just a little longer. The humans were coming. 3 days later, the human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Vela Prime system. Admiral Kate Brennan stood on her bridge and looked at the tactical display showing the Drax positions. There were over 300 enemy warships surrounding the planet, all of them larger and more heavily armed than most human vessels. This is going to be difficult, her tactical officer said quietly. Kate nodded. She had known the odds before they left. The Drax had more ships, bigger guns, and years of combat experience. But they had not counted on one thing: humans fighting not for conquest or resources, but for honor and friendship. Open a channel to all ships, Kate ordered, military and civilian. When the channel was active, she spoke clearly and firmly. This is Admiral Kate Brennan to all human vessels. Today we fight not because we must, but because we choose to. 23 years ago, the Valen saved human lives. Today we repay that debt. Every one of you volunteered to be here, and I am honored to serve with you. Now let us show the galaxy what humanity stands for. All ships advance! The human fleet moved forward in a coordinated wave. The military vessels formed the front line, while the civilian ships spread out behind them in groups based on their capabilities. It was not a perfect formation, but it did not need to be. Everyone knew their role. Warlord Thax watched the approaching fleet with growing confusion. Why were they attacking? They had to know they were outmatched. And why were so many civilian ships mixed in with the military vessels? It made no tactical sense. They are either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, he said. Prepare all weapons. We will destroy them quickly and then finish conquering the planet. The battle began when the first Drax warship fired on the advancing human fleet. A cruiser took the hit on its forward shields, which flared bright blue before stabilizing. Then the human ships returned fire, and space erupted with weapons discharge and explosions. Captain Lisa Morgan commanded her destroyer Defiant with the same skill she had used for 30 years. Her ship weaved between enemy fire, targeting the weapon systems of larger Drax vessels to reduce their effectiveness. Around her, other military ships followed similar tactics, using speed and precision to offset the enemy's advantage in firepower. But what truly shocked the Drax was the civilian fleet. A cargo hauler commanded by Captain Joe Martinez accelerated directly toward a Drax cruiser. The enemy ship tried to destroy the approaching vessel, but Martinez's ship was heavily armored from years of hauling ore through dangerous asteroid fields. It crashed into the cruiser's side at full speed, tearing a massive hole in the hull. Martinez and his crew evacuated in escape pods moments before the impact, but the Drax cruiser was crippled and drifting. One civilian ship had taken down a military cruiser through sheer determination. Mining ships used their industrial cutting lasers to slice through Drax armor. Colony transports coordinated with military vessels to create overlapping fields of fire. Medical ships stayed back but stood ready to receive wounded from both sides, because that was what humans did. The Drax had never fought an enemy like this before. They were used to fighting other military forces where tactics and firepower determined the outcome. But the humans fought differently. They took risks that no trained military would take. Civilian pilots flew their ships into dangerous positions to create opportunities for military vessels. Cargo haulers rammed enemy ships. Transport vessels deliberately drew fire to protect smaller craft. Warlord Thax realized with growing horror that the humans were not fighting to win in a traditional sense. They were fighting to save the Velen, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to do it. Target the civilian vessels, Thax ordered. They have no shields or armor. Destroy them and the humans will retreat. But when Drax ships focused fire on civilian vessels, something unexpected happened. The civilian ships did not flee. Instead, they fought harder. A transport ship called the Prairie Wind, commanded by a grandmother named Helen Brooks, took multiple hits while evacuating Velan civilians from an orbital station. Even as her ship burned and alarms screamed, Helen kept her transport steady until the last refugee was aboard. "I've got everyone," she reported calmly on the open channel. "Taking heavy damage, but we're getting out. Someone cover our escape." 3 military vessels and 2 mining ships immediately moved to protect the transport as it limped away from the battle. The drag ships that tried to pursue were driven back by concentrated fire. This pattern repeated throughout the battle. Every time a ship was in danger, others moved to help regardless of whether they were military or civilian. Humans protected each other with the same determination they were using to protect the Velan. Nick Perry, an engineer on a civilian repair vessel, worked in a damaged hangar bay while his ship was still under fire. He was fixing a fighter craft that had been shot down earlier. "Just 5 more minutes," he muttered as explosions rocked the hull around him. Come on," the fighter launched just as a Drax missile was incoming. The fighter's pilot, barely conscious from his earlier crash, managed to shoot down the missile before it hit the repair vessel. Nick and the pilot had never met before that day, but they had saved each other's lives. The battle raged for 6 hours. Ships on both sides were destroyed or damaged. The human casualties were severe, with dozens of vessels crippled or destroyed and thousands of crew members killed or wounded. But slowly, impossibly, the Drax fleet began to break. Warlord Thax could not understand what was happening. His forces were superior in every measurable way, but they were losing. His captains reported that their crews were becoming demoralized. They had never fought an enemy that simply refused to give up, that kept coming no matter how many ships were destroyed. The turning point came when a small human fighter pilot named Gary Quinn managed to slip through the Drax defensive formations. His fighter was damaged and barely functioning, but he got close enough to the Drax flagship to fire his remaining missiles at the hangar bay entrance. The explosion crippled the flagship's ability to launch or recover fighters. Thax's command ship was suddenly vulnerable, cut off from its support craft. Human vessels sensed the weakness and concentrated their fire on the flagship. Thax made his decision. "All ships retreat. We withdraw from this system." His officers stared at him in shock. The Drax ascendancy never retreated, but Thax knew that if they stayed, they would all die. These humans were insane, fighting with a passion and determination that his professional warriors could not match. The Drax fleet began pulling back, abandoning their positions around Vela Prime. The remaining ships still in orbit surrendered when they realized they had been left behind. The battle was over. On her bridge, Admiral Brennan watched the Drax fleet flee and felt exhaustion wash over her. They had won, but the cost had been terrible. The sky above Vela Prime was filled with ships, but for the first time in weeks they were not there to destroy. Human vessels orbited the wounded planet alongside the few remaining Velan defenders, beginning the long process of rescue and recovery. Medical ships landed on the surface to treat the injured. Cargo haulers brought food and supplies. Engineers worked to restore power and water to the devastated cities. Commander Reshkal emerged from the underground shelter for the first time since the invasion began. He was old and tired, his crystalline skin dull with exhaustion and grief. But he was alive. His people were alive. And it was because humanity had remembered. Admiral Kate Brennan met him in the ruins of what had once been the Velan capital city. The two leaders stood among the rubble of shattered crystal towers while human and Velan workers cleared debris around them. Neither spoke for a long moment. What words could possibly be adequate? Finally, Reshkal broke the silence. His translator device rendered his words in careful human speech. "How many of your people died to save us?" Kate had the numbers memorized. She would never forget them. 4,312 confirmed dead. Another 6,000 wounded, some critically. We lost 87 ships completely destroyed and hundreds more damaged. Reshikal's skin flickered with the deep purple color of profound sorrow. So many humans died for us. I do not understand why you came. The debt was from one ship, one small crew. You sent an armada. Kate thought about how to explain it. How could she make him understand something that was so fundamental to human nature? "Commander, 23 years ago, Captain Paul Griffin and his crew did not have to help you. They could have continued on their way and no one would have blamed them. But they chose to help because it was right. That choice was not just about one crew. It represented all of humanity. When you called for help, you were not calling one captain. You were calling all of us, but the cost, Reshikal said. Thousands of your people died, for what? We have nothing to give you that is worth so many lives. You gave us something 23 years ago, Kate replied. You gave us a debt to honor. You trusted that we would remember. You believed in us. That is worth fighting for. That is worth dying for. Reshikal looked at the human admiral and finally understood. For humanity, honor was not just a word. It was something they would sacrifice everything to maintain. They had traveled across the galaxy, knowing many would die, simply because they had given their word. My people will never forget this, Reshikal said, his translator barely able to capture the emotion in his voice. Every Velan alive today owes their life to humanity. This debt can never truly be repaid. Kate shook her head. There is no debt between friends. You would have done the same for us. Over the following weeks, the human fleet remained in orbit around Vela Prime. Engineers helped rebuild infrastructure. Medical teams treated wounded Velan and trained local doctors in human emergency techniques. Soldiers hunted down the remaining Drax occupation forces that had been left behind. The civilian volunteers who had come to fight were now just as dedicated to rebuilding. Joe Martinez, whose cargo ship had been destroyed when he rammed the Drax cruiser, worked in a refugee camp helping Velan families find shelter. Helen Brooks, the grandmother who had evacuated civilians while under fire, organized food distribution across 3 cities. Nick Perry worked with Velan engineers to restore their manufacturing facilities, sharing human techniques and learning from their advanced designs. Amy Chen, the doctor who had studied under Velan teachers, now taught those same teachers human methods for treating trauma and shock that had been developed during the battle. But the story of what happened at Vela Prime spread far beyond that one planet. News of the battle reached every corner of the galaxy. Other species watched in amazement as reports came in, describing how humanity had sent 15,000 ships to honor a debt from a single rescue mission decades earlier. On Earth, Captain Paul Griffin was invited to speak at a memorial ceremony for those who had died in the battle. He stood before a crowd of thousands and looked at the names inscribed on the memorial wall. So many names, so many people who had volunteered to honor something he had done without thinking. I did not know, he said, his voice shaking slightly, that helping those Velan so long ago would lead to this. If I had known thousands would die, would I have made the same choice? I do not know. But I do know that every person whose name is on this wall made their own choice. They chose to honor a promise. They chose to defend friends who needed them. They chose to show the galaxy what humanity stands for. I am proud of them. I am proud of all of us. The ceremony on Vela Prime was even larger. A massive monument was built in the center of the restored capital city. It was made of crystal and stone, combining Velan and human architectural styles. On its surface were inscribed the names of every human who had died defending Vela Prime, alongside the names of the Velan defenders who had fallen. At the top of the monument, 2 figures stood together, carved in crystal, a human and a Velan reaching toward each other. Below them, words were written in both languages. They came because we needed them. They stayed because we were friends. Admiral Brennan and Commander Reshikal stood together at the unveiling ceremony. Behind them were hundreds of survivors, both human and Velan. As the monument was revealed, there was no cheering or celebration, just quiet tears and shared grief for those who had been lost. But something else was happening across the galaxy. The story of humanity's response had reached the Drax ascendancy. Warlord Thax had been executed for his failure, and the new leadership was reconsidering their expansion policies. If humans would fight so hard to defend one ally, what would they do to defend 10 allies? Or 100? Other aggressive empires were having similar thoughts. The humans had proven they were not just another young species trying to find their place in the galaxy. They were something different. Something potentially dangerous if you made enemies of them. But more importantly, species across the galaxy were reconsidering how they viewed alliances and friendships. If humanity could be trusted to honor debts and defend friends at such cost, perhaps they were worth allying with. Perhaps they represented a new way of thinking about interstellar relations. Within 2 years, the Drax ascendancy collapsed from internal rebellion. The species they had enslaved rose up, emboldened by the example of humanity defending the Velan. Other aggressive empires pulled back their expansion plans, unwilling to risk facing a human fleet. The Velan Confederation and humanity signed a formal alliance, but it was more than just politics. Citizens from both species regularly visited each other's worlds. Human students studied at Velan universities, learning their advanced sciences. Velan researchers worked in human laboratories, fascinated by human innovation and determination. 10 years after the battle, Paul Griffin made one final journey to Vela Prime. He was 78 years old and knew this would likely be his last trip into space. Commander Reshkal, now 93, met him at the spaceport. The two old friends walked slowly through the rebuilt city. The crystal towers had been restored, even more beautiful than before. Velan children played in parks alongside human children from the embassy. Markets sold both human and Velan goods. The two species had become intertwined in ways neither could have imagined. "I want to show you something," Reshkal said, leading Paul to a school on the edge of the city. Inside, young Velan students were learning their history. On the wall was a display showing the memory crystal that Paul had been given so long ago. The teacher was explaining the Battle of Vela Prime to her students. "And so," she said, "humanity came when we called. They remembered a single act of kindness from decades before, and they sent an entire fleet to save us. This is why we say that humanity never forgets a favor." One young student raised her hand. "But teacher, why did so many humans die for us? We are not even the same species." The teacher smiled gently. "That is exactly why their sacrifice means so much. They did not come because they had to, or because they would gain something from it. They came because we were friends who needed help. They showed the galaxy that honor and loyalty matter more than species or politics or profit, and because of their example, the galaxy became a better place." Paul felt tears in his eyes as he listened. Reshkal placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, careful not to press too hard on the old human's fragile frame. "You see," Reshkal said quietly, "you did more than save my ship that day. You showed us what humanity truly is, and when we called for help, your species answered in a way that changed everything." Paul looked at the memory crystal on display. "I just did what felt right. I never thought it would lead to all this." "That is why it did lead to all this," Reshkal replied. "Because you did not think about glory or reward or consequence. You just helped someone who needed it, and your entire species proved they are the same way. You honor debts not because you expect something in return, but because you believe it is right." They stood together in silence, watching the young Velan students learn about the battle that had saved their world. Paul thought about all the people who had died, all the volunteers who had risked everything to honor a promise made before they were even born.